Welcome to the Metropolitan Planning Council. Thank you all for coming out for our roundtable, Weatherproof Collaborative Stormwater Solutions. And I appreciate everyone being here and our speakers, one of whom has disappeared, which is a little alarming. Oh, wow, okay, there she is. I have a good fortune of knowing, I think, half the people in the room, but then I don't know the other half. So I want to take a little bit of a second to explain, because I think for many of you, it's perhaps your first time at an event here at the Metropolitan Planning Council. So a couple seconds on who we are and why this particular topic and forum and speakers today are timely and relevant. Metropolitan Planning Council for about 80 years now. Our anniversary was, I think, 4 Wednesdays ago. We have been in the business of solutions to particularly vexing urban and regional development issues here in the greater Chicago region. And one of those particularly vexing issues is how we deal with all this rain that falls on us from time to time. Our line of work is making the region a better place to live, to work, and in the past 10 years or so, a slightly better place to get rained on. And figuring out how we manage that through physical systems, through natural systems, through financing strategies, through policy innovations, and increasingly through partnerships between units of government. You can imagine at your home, Jason Berry here is from the city of Blue Island, so I'll describe his home. When it rains at Jason's house, his building was built to a code set by one department of his city agency. The infrastructure that the building then drains to is often overseen by another agency. That eventually dumps to an infrastructure controlled by another agency. That eventually goes through treatment processes, which are overseen by regulations from another agency. All that water eventually makes its way to a waterway, which is governed by other agencies. There's a whole lot of folks involved here with just the rain at Jason's house. And that story is common, pervasive throughout the region and in many places. And what it compels us to do is ideally develop solutions at the scale of the problem. And at MPC, we call that right sizing. It's really making sure that you're solving the problem at the scale it needs to be solved at. And that requires systemic solutions. And unless you have collaboration between all the actors in that system, you don't get systemic solutions. And that's what we're trying to work towards. We have a unique opportunity here at MPC, along with many of our partners. And you'll hear more about this, much more in the next few weeks and in the coming year. But very soon, in the next few weeks, we anticipate the governor of Illinois announcing some reaffirmed and renewed priorities in an initiative called Millennium Reserve. And this has been around in a constantly evolving process for several years. And you will hear more about it, and I'm not going to trump our governor by talking too much about it. But one of those priorities is to improve collaboration and ideally coordination and partnerships on stormwater management and the use of gray and green infrastructure in an area broadly defined as the Calumet region. So the south side of Chicago and the southern suburbs in Cook County. To identify some common problems that we're trying to solve, some common goals, and some actions that can be taken between US EPA, City of Chicago, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, individual southern suburbs, land managers like Open Lands or the Cook County Land Bank Authority, to develop some common strategies for the tools, the rules, the goals, the roles, that's the end of the rhyming, the actions, the timeline, the evaluation processes, everything that is necessary for building collaborative solutions at a system scale. We're calling that group the Calumet Stormwater Collaborative. The members of that group met just before this meeting, and it is no coincidence that today's roundtable is about successful or ongoing, on the way to successful, collaborative stormwater solutions happening elsewhere in the country. Solutions that require common understanding of goals, development of tools, and partnerships between units of government. And so today's speakers, Lorenz Vandertak from CH2M Hill is in the business of tool creation, tools that build partnerships. They are also the sponsor of today's event, for which we are very grateful. Susan Harper from Seattle Public Utilities is largely in the business of building those partnerships and communications and engagement of all those partners within the specific solutions that are being implemented in Seattle. And then Bob Newport from US EPA is here to talk about some initiatives that they've been involved throughout the Midwest, throughout Region 5, which is his geography of concern, Cincinnati, Toledo, Detroit, Gary, it keeps going, on and on and on. Our outline for today is our three speakers are going to talk about what it takes to build those collaborative solutions. Then we hope to have a lot of time for question and answer, that's often our most productive time. I should note that when we get to the question and answer, we are live broadcasting this event on YouTube right now. If you're really too modern, you can watch this event on YouTube instead of paying attention here in the room, if you really want that experience. But we are live broadcasting this on our YouTube channel, so when the time comes to do the Q&A, our colleague Caitlin, who's somewhere around, will be walking a microphone around. Oh, Caitlin's right here in the front. That's where she is. She'll be walking a microphone around. Wait for her to get there, and then tell us who you are and sort of what your role is here in the northeastern Illinois area or Indiana on stormwater management, and then ask your question. And just remember the questions end with question marks. So that's the outline. I don't want to take any more time away from our speakers, so I'm going to invite Lorenz to come up first and talk about CH2M Hill's work here and elsewhere, and how they build tools that build partnerships. Thanks, Lorenz.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And it's a real pleasure. Do I just advance this to get my first slide? There you go. All right. Okay. Well, Josh gave me 12 to 15 minutes to talk, and I have way too many slides, so I'm going to go through some of these very fast just to whet your appetite so we can talk about it more during discussion period. Talking about successful experiences of regional collaboration and decision tools supporting MS4, and just for those of you who don't know, MS4, Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, and some of these are also CSO permit compliance. So lots and lots of case studies I'll flip through. So I'm going to start out just by giving some examples of regional collaborations that I've seen addressing stormwater issues, and also just touch very briefly on climate resilience, because that's coming in more and more, a lot of these discussions. Green infrastructure programs, I'm going to highlight two examples in particular, Onondaga County and Syracuse, New York, and then Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And then a whole variety of tools as well, talking about site evaluations, tools, developing business case, triple bottom line analysis, and then a whole series of different ideas in financing, which I do a fair amount of. So let's just jump right into the regional collaborations. The first one I'm going to talk about is something called HR Storm. It was put together by the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. It's the region of southeastern Virginia. They put together a stormwater education program essentially driven by the obligations of their permits in that tidewater area. You see the region, this is the southeastern corner of Virginia in that map. It was a coalition of local governments. 16 different cities and counties participated in this. It started back in 1992. I'm going to date myself. I was there when they founded this thing. And it was a really, really important effort to make sure that they came up with a consistent message in educating their public. All of their permits require that they have educational outreach programs. So just a few things what HR Storm does. It's still going on to this day. In 2011, they broadened it. Originally, it was just Storm, so that is there a pointer with this thing? Yeah. This was the original HR Storm. They've now broadened it to what they called Ask HR Green to cover broader environmental topics, essentially providing a variety of things, materials, tools, media kits, tips. They essentially are the forum on a regional basis for organizing educational outreach programs. And recently they did a series of surveys to just see if they're being effective in changing people's behaviors, because that's really what it's all about. I can provide you some of that background in the next piece. Switching to where I come from, the Washington, D.C. area. Washington, D.C. has two activities going on, one for D.C. itself and one, again, for the broader region. The Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, somewhat analogous to MPC, has a regional stormwater committee that's been in place for many, many years. And they also provide collaboration on a variety of activities, a clearinghouse of resources. They host meetings like the one that you just had and have regular meetings to essentially help guide their regulatory compliance strategies as well as education and outreach tools. One other thing I wanted to mention, this is actually perhaps not regional in nature, but inside Washington, D.C., they've formed a technical working group on stormwater issues. And the reason I bring this up is that invariably what happens is different jurisdictions will send just their stormwater guy. It might be in the Public Works Department, utilities, and forget that stormwater covers just about every single agency in the government. And so Washington, D.C.'s formed this technical working group that essentially straddles, I think, 7 different agencies within Washington, D.C., all of whom have some sort of stormwater responsibility. And it helps them with their annual MS4 reporting requirements. They just developed a new set of stormwater regulations and guidance documents. So different success stories there. Now, this next one isn't stormwater directly, but I thought I would bring it up because when you put together a regional collaborative, you have to think about governance, and I encourage you on May 2nd to think a little bit about how you're going to formalize this. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's not formal. In the case of the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, they actually went ahead with the 4 counties in southeastern Florida, signed a memorandum of understanding amongst all of them that they were going to contribute funds to support a variety of issues in the area of climate change, including for them sea level rise being a huge issue, storm surge, of course the changes in extreme events of various kinds. So those are some successful examples of regional collaboratives I just wanted to mention. So getting on to green infrastructure, which is a lot of what the discussion has been about recently in complying with stormwater programs, I'm going to jump into two case studies here that essentially combine gray versus green. Onondaga County, this is their supervisor, have made a significant commitment several years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, to change their CSO compliance program from one that was all based on gray solutions, a lot of storage tanks, a lot of pumps, pipes, and valves, to one that's entirely green. They're no longer including any additional gray infrastructure. Obviously, they did a fair amount of that investment at their wastewater plant, pump stations, but going forward, it's going to be entirely a green system. And they have done an awful lot since this was kicked off. They basically did a rapid analysis that was driven by a consent judgment. They formed a close partnership between the city and county. So again, some regional aspects to that. And they have completed, this says 50 projects. I think the number is now well over 120, as it says in the bottom right, and I think it's actually over 150. Green infrastructure projects start out with an overall GI plan for the entire city-county area, and then they're basically targeting a whole suite of different types of measures. And I'll give you some examples. But a few things they're very proud of. First of all, it's they have the first hockey ice rink that's completely supplied by a stormwater cistern, rainwater capture. Second largest green roof in New York State, and a CSO treatment wetlands that has gotten a USGBC Leadership Award. So a lot of things they're very proud of. So a few before and after pictures up here. The first one is one of their green the street corridors. So this is a street beforehand, and this is actually pervious asphalt and pervious parking that was done afterwards. And here's a parking lot before and after was converted entirely for green infrastructure methods. Essentially, all the water that falls on these now essentially infiltrates up to, I think it's an inch and a half of rainwater. Another very important thing with all these, and I'll get back to this in the second half, is incentive mechanisms. When you do green infrastructure, invariably you have to do a lot of it on private property. And it's a challenge for you as public entities to figure out how to do that. So you have to incentivize that through a variety of mechanisms, rebates, credits. And this is just one example of a house that bought into the green infrastructure fund they had in Syracuse. So this shows its parking lot and what it was afterwards with the pervious pavement and a green space that was built in. So really bringing in a lot of community activities. Another really critical element that I'll emphasize many, many times is when you do green infrastructure, you can't do it by itself. It has to be integrated with other infrastructure programs. The most common one is transportation facilities, but there's lots of other infrastructure programs that you can tie it to. So you have to understand that, because oftentimes the incremental cost of green infrastructure is small if you tie it to these other projects. That's really the key message. So this is that connective corridor in Onondaga County after they did the project. So they have bike paths that are built in, pervious pavement, bioswales, and so forth. Another very important part, since this is really about regulatory compliance, is you have to have ways to track your performance, both from a variety of different methods. Sort of 3 basic critical elements from an engineering perspective. First is just having a really good understanding of your impervious surfaces. So you have to have good mapping, ideally down to the parcel level of where your impervious surfaces are, and then how much of it you've actually retrofitted over time. So when you do your annual reporting, you can report that information. And of course, to target where you're going to do green infrastructure, you have to have good modeling and good monitoring to support that. So you can track that as well. Now, the next thing that's really important is making sure you have a good maintenance program. the whole issue of maintenance and green infrastructure comes up an awful lot. And there's no one right answer to it, but it is important that you have a well-established maintenance criteria. How you actually go forward with that, especially for private property, is a bit of a challenge. But Onondaga County had a maintenance manual that they developed right up front, which they're using. And they have an asset management program to track all of their facilities so that they can maintain them on a regular basis. Now, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, another example, much smaller scale, but this community has also made the decision to go from a gray approach to managing their CSO to essentially an all-green approach. And they basically costed out, their gray solution would have cost them $300 million for a city of 60,000 people. That's a lot of money. Their green infrastructure approach is going to be somewhere between 70 and $100 million, depending how intensively they do it. So $75 million is the overall current implementation program on public space, and then they're going to do an additional amount on private property. So this, just a few quick images of things that have happened. So they focus on different programmatic elements, roads and alleys. So this shows a before and after view of one of the road bioretention areas. Just like here in Chicago, there's an alley program before and after their green alley captures rainfall. Parking lots are being addressed as well through pervious asphalt, again, bioretention islands and various sorts, and of course, green roofs. You all know green roofs pretty well here in Chicago, having one of the first, I think, or the first. So, but again, there's a lot of impervious area out there, so you have to do an awful lot of this before you start really making a difference in terms of stormwater. And this shows that it's going to take them probably 25 years to get through their program. One thing that was very important for them was to have a comprehensive green infrastructure plan that identified what they were going to do where so that they could then leverage funds from other sources. There was a brief discussion of SRF funds in the earlier meeting. Lancaster, because they had one of the most well-developed GI plans, they were able to use that to leverage to get SRF funds. And just in the last 3 years, they've gotten $11.5 million from the state in various forms to support their GI program. One jurisdiction. So I'm going to flip very quickly through a whole variety of specific examples in different categories, green streets, green parks, and so forth, just to give you a flavor for some green infrastructure that's been done. So this is a public park. Public parks are often a great opportunity, and the thing that's neat about taking a park like this is not only upgrading the park and the recreational facilities, but you can manage quite a bit of surrounding area if you think hard about the drainage in the surrounding communities. So in this particular jurisdiction, probably can just make this out. This is actually the ballpark that was being captured. Replaced it with a pervious basketball court. And then all the surrounding neighborhoods were tied in. So they have individual drainage areas from parts of the surrounding streets. They're all brought into the underground reservoir under that basketball court, and they're infiltrating it. Unfortunately, I don't have the video that's tied to this, but this is the opening ceremony, and the mayor, whose name happens to be Gray and green, Mayor Gray. This shows them dumping buckets of water onto the basketball court and going quickly through that. It's very, very popular. So this is another example of a park that got converted before and after. This is actually the original concepts. They're going to capture between 4 million gallons per year. 15 cents per gallon is the way it was costed out. You already saw this picture, but sort of the key message again here is if you do a green alley by itself or do a repaving project by itself, it costs a lot. But if you do it as an incremental part of an alley program, the incremental costs are fairly small. And this actually shows the delta for just the GI, the green infrastructure piece of it is only 10% versus conventional repaving of that green alley. ADA programs, fairly significant area that a lot of jurisdictions are dealing with. You can always tie in green infrastructure associated with the ADA prioritization of sidewalks and ramps and so forth. Of course, tying it into traffic is a key part to all this. And then public outreach is key to it. You have to make sure you have good communication to the public as what the function is of all this different green infrastructure. And this is an example of a brochure and poster that they used in Lancaster. They also have a fairly aggressive tree canopy program that we can talk about later on. So let's talk about tools. first of all, it's very important to have a good way to develop the business case on a property-by-property basis for moving ahead with green infrastructure. So we've got different tools for doing that. This is a way too complicated spreadsheet to go through the details. The bottom line is you can come up with a business case, dollars per gallon removed on a property-by-property basis that helps you then make the case for moving forward. This actually is an example of an award we just got from DC Water, their Green Infrastructure Challenge. This is happening more and more doing these challenge programs. And they were heavily emphasizing not just how much stormwater you capture, but the other environmental benefits. A whole series of those, plus the economic benefits and the social benefits, creating jobs, reducing heat island effects, and some of these other benefits. And this actually is an example from my colleague, Mason Thronberg. We've actually put together some modeling tools that actually allow you to optimize where you place green infrastructure within an overall city context if you have a good understanding of the overall CSO system and the models that go with it. Now I'm going to switch gears to talk about financing. I was recently the co-lead author on the Water Environment Federation's user fee funded stormwater manual, essentially updating how you go about setting up stormwater utilities and user fees. And they are a very useful mechanism to provide reliable, dedicated source of funding. It's also politically very challenging to do, particularly in large cities, but more and more of them are doing this. And once you have something like this, you can create an incentive mechanism by reducing the fee people charge if they have green infrastructure on their properties through a credit mechanism, or having a rebate and grant program that's funded through that. And ideally, you have a bit of both. So the rebate helps with your upfront costs, and the credit incentivizes maintenance ongoing into the future to keep the costs down for the private ratepayers. So one other thing I want to talk about, going back to the previous example, is public-private partnerships. Those rebate programs, often people view them as a way to fund the entire system, but what we found is much better to have them pay only an incremental cost and have some of the costs come from the local participant. And that usually helps get them on board with the overall program once they understand what its benefits are. And this is examples from both the jurisdictions I just spoke about. This is Lancaster. They had $7 million in SRF loans, and then they also had a variety of grant programs that have been funded through that. And Onondaga County also had a rebate program, what they called their Green Improvement Fund. They were very creative, I think, in making sure that they didn't put themselves into a box as to how much they would fund for a given type of project. Some jurisdictions say, well, we'll have $1,200 for rain gardens, and that's the most we'll give to a given property. But what they found in Onondaga County is that some of the largest properties were the ones who really could use the rebate programs the most, and so they actually targeted it at those large properties up front. And just one last little thing from DC. One of the challenges a lot of private property owners have is what would it do for me making that investment? Well, DC put together something called the Green Up DC tool, which essentially allows an individual property to go in a web interface to their property, look how much impervious area they have, what their stormwater runoff is. All that's calculated before they even do anything. And then they can digitize impervious area, say, well, how much green roof could I treat? Or how much could I treat with a cistern or rain barrel? This allows them to do all those what-ifs of what the potential reduction is. And the next step for them is going to be the actual credit tied to their fee. Washington, D.C. does have an impervious area-based fee. So this basically shows their overall program. They also have a solar component to it as well, solar PV. It allows you to go through the planning of your projects, look at different things that other people put in place, and tracking. DC is using this for their MS4 permit annual reports. And then there's a lot of resources on there as well for moving forward. As I said, it calculates the stormwater. Oops, I'm going through that very quickly. It calculates the stormwater runoff. It gives you the choice of putting multiple different GI properties, so green roof, rain barrels, and so forth. You can actually test those for an individual property. I'm done. Did I get it done? Final conclusion. Essentially, regional collaboration increases the effectiveness of stormwater programs. I've seen this time and time again in my 25 years of doing this stuff, particularly on the education side and the financing side. If you want to get some common aspects, you need to focus on those, in my view. And another common element of the regional collaborations I've seen that are successful is having a very strong leader. So someone like Josh to facilitate. Pressure. But I mean, all those examples I gave early on, they all had someone like that who could just herd the cats, make everyone work together towards this common goal. And of course, balancing gray with green infrastructure approaches can lead to cost-effective compliance. They're aligned to your broader range of planning and economic development goals. And there's a bunch of tools out there that can help you with the planning. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, man. We'll do all the questions at the end. So I'll just leave this up for people to digest for a second. It's a great overview of the tools and the processes that have been played out in a variety of different instances. Susan's going to give us a really deep dive on the city of Seattle. You can come on over, Susan. You know, it rains a fair bit in Seattle, so they have a fair amount of reason to tackle some of these issues. And I can say from experience, here at the Metropolitan Planning Council, we've been running a fairly modest grant program in the Logan Square neighborhood of Chicago, which was an Illinois Green Infrastructure Grant Award. Amy Walkenbach is here from Illinois EPA. Thanks. And that grant program, comparable to some of the ones that Lorenz just identified, you know, the city of Chicago had identified a couple of neighborhoods in the city with a higher rate of basement backups and a higher incidence of flooding. And so we chose to work in Logan Square, and over the course of a couple of years, we're able to allocate a couple $100,000 for 14 projects that are now getting in the ground. And the value and importance of communications in both making people comfortable with this, comfortable enough to take money to do something on their property, cannot be underscored. And I wish I had known Susan Harper 3 years ago, because that would have really helped. But Susan's the expert on this and is going to tell us all about how they make this work in Seattle. Take it away. That's yours.
Microphone. I chose not to have a lot of slides for y'all, so you'll just have to look at me, and I've got some visual aids that I'll pull up later. So if you read my bio, you can see I've actually worked in the environmental community for about 25 years myself, but the first approximate 12 years was spent as an advocate and a land use advocate for environmental issues. So I did a lot of coordinating with advocacy groups, and the key there is to have more zeal than all your, your peers. So, how late can you stay up making that newsletter to get the word out? So I have a lot of that, and then I got hired by the city of Seattle in 2002 to do communications, mainly for capital projects. So we do a lot of work out of sight, out of mind. I tell you that, your mailbox is going to be disrupted, or maybe your alley won't be available. We're going to rip up your street and compact your soils. Maybe if any of you who actually do construction projects, capital projects, know what that means. And the significance of my work grew as I became the outreach and coordinator and planner for what we call Restore Our Waters at the City of Seattle. So I think of myself as the environmental advocate. A lot of the groups I work with sometimes are in an adversarial role with the City of Seattle, if you can imagine. So I help to be that different face, and I helped convince my colleagues, engineers, planners, policy folks, that it's a really, really great idea to work with these people to help, and these organizations to help us do our work, because we do have a similar goal. Water quality, we want a clean environment, we want better neighborhoods, we want walkable neighborhoods, bikeable neighborhoods, or, and I'm speaking to Seattle, which of course, your geography is so different than ours, but I think the core issues are the same. So the map you're seeing on here is, of course, Seattle, and we participate in the greater King County area. So in the greater King County area, there's about 1.3 million people. We have about 700,000 in Seattle proper. So on the stormwater fronts, what we've done is we're really working on having people understand what their contribution is to the stormwater problem. So we're looking at managing stormwater one home at a time. Of course, the other impacts of teaching people at home to use a rain barrel or a cistern. Cisterns are like 250 gallons, if you're familiar with that. Rain barrels are a little smaller. The cisterns have more impact for storage. and then rain gardens. So our RainWise program is eligible in all those areas that you see. If you go to rainwise.seattle.gov, you can put in your address if you live in the city and find out if you're eligible. The average rebate's about $4,000. We give about $3.50 per square foot of the rooftop. And it is a business case, so we've compared that with how much it would cost to store. And I want to say it's really important when you're educating the public not to diminish the value of gray infrastructure, because guess what? In the end, we want to protect the environment. Both of these strategies work. One's more appealing, one makes it more visible, the other one's underground, out of sight, out of mind. So it's an opportunity, actually, for us to look at green infrastructure as a public amenity that people are going to value over time. And then, as you know, maintenance is something that we'll have to talk about, too. So the public's really going to be your best friend, or not. And I'm sure if any planners out there know that. So what I formed in 2011, with the support of my colleagues, and Tracy Tackett was really instrumental in that, was a group called the Green Infrastructure Partnership. The group named itself. So what I did is I went about finding all these neighborhood sustainability groups, these environmental groups like People for Puget Sound, stewardship partners, resource media, and what I found is they're all getting excited about rain gardens. And our RainWise program, which was implemented in the yellow area, the yellow there is Ballard first, I found out that rain gardens were just all over the map. What is a rain garden? How do you build it? And people were just sort of calling things rain gardens. I went to my colleagues and said, you know, we need consistency here. If we're going to have a standard around rain gardens, our counterparts out there in the NGO community need to know what's going on with those and what standards there are. So instead of dictating to them, because that doesn't really work well, I opened the table and set a collaborative table. And what happened is key groups, People for Puget Sound, Stewardship Partners, which was doing a 12,000 rain gardens project, King County, which is our local county, you know, we're in the broader area, myself, we all got together, we called ourselves the Rain Garden Stakeholders, the first meeting, and we did a grassroots style meeting, you know, with the papers on the walls, and we all talked about what are our priorities, where do we want to go. And what we did is we got together, we called ourselves the Green Infrastructure Partnership, we created a purpose for ourselves that we all could agree on, a little subcommittee went about, you know, coming up with the verbiage, brought it back, you know, tried not to do that in, you know, in the big group because you don't want to go too far into how you say what with a large group of people. And we came up with a purpose to increase networking, collaborating, and coordinating opportunities for public engagement, to bolster the voluntary adoption of green infrastructure as a viable, affordable, and effective solution to reduce stormwater runoff polluting Puget Sound. So this group continued to meet every third Thursday of the month and continues to meet. We have found that the group itself was really helpful when we had some negative media. We did a project in Ballard. It was a natural drainage project or a green infrastructure project in the right-of-way. And unfortunately, some of the calculations were off, and so we actually had to move some of the roadside rain gardens, we'll call them, because they weren't operating properly. And let me tell you, you do that, you change some parking, you move some things around, and then it doesn't work. Oh my God, we were just wrecked. Well, King County also operates some of our combined sewer overflow areas down in the south. And they were very concerned that their project that they were just starting was going to get nixed, because you know what happens when the politicians hear the neighborhoods roar. And this is a pretty affluent neighborhood, so it knew how to, they had a blog called, you know, that was just bashing our project. It was horrible. But this group came together and collaborated and realized that they needed to make sure green infrastructure wasn't going to, you know, get this kind of a bad rap in the media, and they helped us overcome the media. So instead of the city of Seattle going out and saying, you know, we'll fix it, da-da-da-da, these guys were all going out and making their own social media and going out to their membership and really pushing green infrastructure. Of course, we changed the project. We did meet with the community locally, and as a government, we did the responsible thing. But having these collaborators outside talking to the same community was awesome. So it's very important. We've also awarded some outreach contracts through our program, through Rainwise and through the city, and King County has done the same with grants. So this group is becoming, you know, increasing its acumen with our support, but they still have independence. They want to grow their memberships. What's in it for them? Some of our reasons that people will attend the Green Infrastructure Partnership, because nobody's going to come unless there's a reason for themselves. They network. We've created support for each individual organization's projects. They've actually collaborated on some or found funding to work together. They are learning new information. And then we have also done some outreach events, like Seattle's Next 50 event. It was a big Seattle Center downtown event. We got our own tent, and it was the GRIP, the Green Infrastructure Partnership tent. So when you went in there, you know, people got to, you know, pour water on pervious and you know, the ones that, you know what the porous pavement. That was a big hit, by the way. I'm not an engineer, just so you know. Some of their priority topics are really low impact development. We have a high focus on multicultural outreach and equity around GSI. What we found, we call it green stormwater infrastructure. That's another thing. We'll call it green infrastructure. I'll go back and say no more stormwater in that word. But what we find is in the more low-income neighborhoods or diverse neighborhoods, there's more gray there. And how do we kind of create this equity? So we're doing a lot of study on that. We've funded some organizations to do that. So through this group, they're coming together and learning from each other. The participants largely drive the agenda. And I just want to show you a few of the things that have come out of some of this. We've done a lot of collaborations. There's this awesome 12,000 Rain Gardens little brochure that everyone had input on and can use to sort of describe what a functional and beautiful garden can do for you. There's another program, it's called Toxic, and it's really around stormwater management, and it's, you know, local groups talking to their local community about what they can do to manage stormwater. So this isn't me talking, this is somebody else, you know, a neighborhood group. We have a lot of sustainability groups in Seattle. There's also, like, for our Rainwise, they really personalized in Ballard what it means to get a rain garden. On the back, there's a little walking tour. Inside, it talks about our program more specifically, but as you can see, it's been branded by the neighborhood group. Grassroots is the best way to do incentive programs. We do, there's also the 12,000 Rain Garden program, again, a collaborative kind of brochure. So when you see things coming out like this, people see it as a groundswell of excitement. Two of the main funded things that we're really excited about and the GRIP group helped with is, one is how do you create advocacy for rain gardens, and it's a communications manual. It's really friendly because you know you have those people in the neighborhoods that want to make it happen. And then secondly, a rain garden care manual. And this is something that, you know, we talked about maintenance. How do you make that easier and more friendly? You'll find these on different websites or links from our website to theirs. So rainwise.seattle.gov is where you'll find a lot of this information. And finally, in our region, WSU, Washington State University, with a lot of our technical folks, created this great rain garden handbook for Western Washington. You need one for your own region because clearly the soils and the information is going to be different. But this has really been helpful for partners so that don't have the technical resources that maybe the city is willing to give to its partners. So this kind of handbook is really helpful for the smaller municipalities or environmental groups that want to be advocates, and it's very well done. I have all these here. I have so much more I could share with you, but I also want to be respectful of your questions and our other speaker. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, you're perfect. All right, so our final speaker for this audience in the Midwest needs no introduction because he regulates half of the people in the room, so you all know him. Bob Newport, US EPA Region 5 from across the street, is here to talk about some initiatives they've been working on throughout the Midwest and how not only integrating stormwater with other community development issues, but even within specific jurisdiction, getting multiple departments and agencies to speak together and collaborate, which is a challenge even before you introduce a second jurisdiction bordering them. So, Bob, take it away. And then we'll have plenty of time to
Thanks, Josh. I wanted to thank MPC for convening us today. And our speakers for traveling in, thank you guys. It was really a pleasure to meet you and hear what you had to say. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. First, what I might classify as opportunities for collaboration. What are some things that come along where we can work together and be effective? And then talk about some methods and ideas for effective collaboration. But I'm going to start off with a case study just to kind of highlight what are some of the benefits that can come out of creative thinking and successful collaboration. And this example comes from Cincinnati. This is an area, a drainage area in Cincinnati near downtown. It's called the Lick Run Drainage Area, and it's kind of a valley-shaped area. And what you see in this image is what it looked like before development occurred. And of course, when it would rain, water would come down the sides of the hills, and then there was a channel that would run and move the water to a receiving water downstream. As we did development in this area, of course, we created roads and other impervious surfaces, and then being good stewards of, to protect the property owners, we put in sewer systems, and we did a great job of collecting the water off of this whole drainage area. And we put a 17-foot pipe underneath where the water, the drainage system used to be the natural drainage area, and we completely eliminated that river that was there. And at the same time we did that, we created the largest CSO point in the city of Cincinnati, which you see at the bottom of that image there is CSO 5, because we collected all that rainwater and put it in a combined sewer system, and it would overflow when it rained. So we were looking at solutions for the CSO issue in this area, and the original solution was to build a deep tunnel, and it would go in that vicinity of where you see CSO 5 on the right in that image. But people kept talking about this, said there's got to be a better solution. And this image shows the alternative solution that kind of emerged from that planning work. And it's sort of like a what's old is new type of a solution. We're going to take the clear water, the rainwater, out of the sewer system, run it down some bioswales and natural systems, and put it in an above-ground channel. And it creates this green space that runs from east to west, or west to east. And it creates a lot of different look for that community. So you solve that CSO problem with a sort of non-conventional solution. And so this is a win for the CSO authority. Instead of building the tunnel, they're going to build this above ground system, keep water out of the system, still meet their CSO control objective, and they're going to save money. But it's also a win for the community, a potentially a significant win. The adjoining streets now become Parkside Drives, and there's opportunity for economic revitalization along those streets. And this is an environmental justice neighborhood, and there's going to be what we anticipate environmental justice related benefits, neighborhood stabilization, and improved opportunities for recreation. So it's kind of a win for the community and a win for the sewer district. But logistically, this is a much more complicated project for the sewer district, and you see some of the complications here. They have to get into the business of land acquisition for that whole green corridor to acquire all those properties. And then these were commercial and industrial properties. Many of them may be brownfield sites. So you get into brownfield issues, and there's a lot of structures that have to be demolished. And you run into historic preservation as soon as you talk about the demolitions of some structures. We have to reroute some streets around the new green corridor. You run into zoning issues. It was zoned commercial industrial. And there's a lot of need for community involvement because you're changing the look and feel of this community. So you have to have extensive work. We needed Susan here in Cincinnati. Extensive work talking with the neighbors. And then you have to think about who's going to do maintenance. So it's a much more complicated project for the sewer district. And you have to work with all kinds of different stakeholder groups and partners. And you see just some of them on this slide here. So the lesson that we take away from the Cincinnati experience is collaboration can produce win-win outcomes, and it can help save money. It can provide a lot of community benefits. But providing for effective collaboration and working in partnership can actually be a lot of work. And sometimes there's a lot of barriers, and you need to create enough momentum to overcome those barriers for that project to proceed. You have to be able to quantify the benefits and communicate the benefits for all the different stakeholder groups. And you need to have creative problem solving and kind of a shared vision to overcome sort of the institutional inertia that comes with implementing a project like that. Lauren's talked a little bit about opportunities to collaborate between parks and stormwater. And parks are a natural place to think about green infrastructure. There's a lot of green space there already. But we can't just use the parks as a dumping ground for stormwater. Eric Otto's here. He knows all about this subject. And there has to be something in it for the park district. As we think about like the demands for parks these days, there's an emerging demand for things like trails and connectivity, natural areas and habitat. Park officials are thinking about things like, what's our maintenance budget? Can we cut down on our mowing by using maybe native plants instead of turf? And so what that means is there are opportunities for a win-win outcome here. And I'll just show you one example. Angie, I think you introduced us to this example. This is a park in South Holland called Veterans Memorial Park, and it's a very traditional park. It has sports fields, there's a picnic area, it has ornamental landscaping. And one of the things that was added at this park was this naturalized basin. And it's referred to by the park officials as a wetland basin. There you see some frogs there sometimes, and you see butterflies. And what happens is the parents, when the kids are at soccer practice or Little League, they'll come over and visit this basin. They refer to it as their ecological area. It added a new feature to the park, and it manages the stormwater off of a nearby subdivision. So this was an example of like a win-win situation. This is another one. This is in Inverness, and the park district here wanted to. There's a wetland in the background in this picture where those trees are, and the park was very interested in protecting that wetland from stormwater impacts. The Stormwater Authority had a subdivision that was sending its water over. That was an opportunity for collaboration between those groups, and they created this wetland area. This was also worked on by the Inverness Garden Club and a group called the Citizens for Conservation, and that was two groups that traditionally never got along. The conservation groups were always telling the Garden Club that they should use native plants and deep-rooted plants, and they worked together to do this design, and then after that they found out they could peacefully coexist. So that was a side benefit from this project. Another natural opportunity for collaboration is with schools. There's lots of impervious surfaces at schools. Sometimes there's a lot of land. If you can create green infrastructure at a school location, you can have an outdoor learning laboratory for the kids and manage the stormwater off of all those impervious surfaces. Homeowner associations, another great opportunity for collaboration between the municipal government and the homeowner associations. This is an example from a homeowner association in Naperville called Donata Woods. And I don't know if you guys can see in the picture, but there's a blue heron flying across here, which sort of made me think, if you build it, they will come. They naturalized this area to soak in water and to trap pollutants. And it provided great stormwater management, but it also looked really nice. It was an amenity for the homeowner association and had a positive impact on property values. So here again, with the right combination, you create this win-win scenario. You can foster that collaboration and get good things done. Corporate campuses, another great opportunity for this kind of collaboration. This is Tell Labs in Naperville, where they manage the stormwater off of their parking lot and some bioswales. They manage basically all their stormwater on site with no discharge to the local sewer system. And as Lorenz alluded to, there's lots of opportunities for collaboration between stormwater authorities and transportation organizations. In Chicago, 23% of the land area is part of the public right-of-way. So it's a great space opportunity to put in green infrastructure, and lots of the runoff into the system comes off of roads. So if you can put green infrastructure next to the roads, it's a great way to capture a lot of water. There's a lot of different synergies that can be achieved, one of them being traffic calming. If you have a transportation objective of traffic calming, you can put in green infrastructure in your islands and meet both those objectives at the same time. But there's a lot of barriers that can be encountered when you talk about syncing up a green infrastructure project and a transportation project. One of them can be that the design standards for the transportation organization don't automatically accommodate some of the green practices. And sometimes combining the funding sources together can be complicated. You get into questions about who will do the maintenance, and then you have a challenge of aligning schedules. Sometimes the funding for transportation is 3 years out, and the funding you have for green infrastructure is 1 year out. How do you make those schedules line up? But there's a huge advantage to aligning the work on your green infrastructure implementation with other road work that's being done. There's at least a 20% savings from the cases we've looked at when you do those two things together versus when you do those things separately. One of the, another example of where there's sort of an economic impact associated with a street project is from Lansing, Michigan. This is a street called Michigan Avenue. It's near the state capitol, and this is what the lovely streetscape looked like before the retrofit. You can see it's almost all impervious surfaces, and all that water was running into the city's combined sewer system. So what they decided to do was implement a system of gardens along the road to take water off of the sidewalk and off of the street. And that project was very successful from a CSO perspective. Any 1 inch rain is basically completely managed in those gardens. And there's one block where they can take like a 4 inch rain. But the other thing was the merchants thought the street looked a lot better. It was like an economic revitalization strategy for that street. At the same time, it was a stormwater strategy. And we see lots of other examples of where there's economic development that can be associated with green infrastructure, including we had the Department of Commerce in Wisconsin talk to us about a green industrial park. We had the Small Business Administration in Detroit talk to us about setting up small firms to provide maintenance. Reggie talked this morning about an example in the south suburbs where they're going to form a company to provide installation and maintenance of green infrastructure. So it's local job creation can be associated with that. As we sort of mentioned in the Cincinnati example, there needs to be collaboration a lot of times with the brownfields program. So you want to understand what are the requirements that are applicable. Have soil surveys been done? Are we at all worried about infiltrating practices through those soils? And a group that we've been collaborating with recently have been land banks in Detroit. This is a picture from Detroit. The county and the city land bank own, there's about 80,000 vacant parcels in Detroit, and there's a significant number of them are owned by the land banks. And the land banks are trying to decide what are we going to do with these parcels and which ones might be well suited for green infrastructure. An issue that we've run into there is demolitions, because lots of the vacant parcels still have abandoned buildings on them, and the Treasury Department's given $50 million to Detroit just for demolitions to try to improve conditions in the blighted neighborhoods. And that led us to a whole nother set of questions that arose, because we saw a lot of problems after demolitions were done where the basements were left in, the impervious surfaces were left in, the sites were in really poor condition for implementing green infrastructure. So one of the things that we did, Lauren's talked about the idea of tools being a thing that you can develop, but we developed a tool for green demolition, which sounds like an oxymoron, but the idea was that you could specify soil conditions and drainage conditions that are post-demolition as part of the specifications and leave the site in a condition that's much more conducive for green infrastructure. And then the last example for collaboration is kind of an obvious one, is to think together about your planning for flooding and disaster response in conjunction with your stormwater management. And we heard this morning about some funds for disaster recovery that are going to be available in Cook County. Glenview received, I think, $2 million from Ike for disaster recovery. There's a lot of opportunity to think about your stormwater management system and your resiliency and disaster recovery together. So what I wanted to end with was a couple thoughts about methods for effective collaborations. And One of the things that EPA is fortunate is we're able to do a lot of convening. When we call a meeting, for some reason, a lot of people come to the meeting. And so we convene discussions with local groups and state agencies and federal partners. We try to have convene meetings with business leaders. We talk with funders like foundations to see how can we coordinate the public funding and the foundation funding. We provide technical assistance on a number of subjects like brownfields properties, to assemble multiple properties, what to do about historic preservation, what can we do with the zoning to update the zoning code to accommodate green infrastructure. So convening and providing technical assistance and tools can be really big assets for effective collaboration. And you heard Lauren's use the word leadership. I think it does require a convener and somebody to sort of get everybody together and talk through the shared objectives to get everybody on the same page, and then you can develop a plan that everybody's bought into. So you look for those common goals and establish a shared vision. You try to look for these win-win situations where, you know, what's in it for you and what's in it for you, and we all have a motivation to work together here. And that sometimes leads to these sort of multi-purpose projects like the project in Lansing where it's an economic development project and it's a stormwater project. We want to communicate about what the benefits are and try to quantify those benefits because people will be more apt to buy in if you've sort of talked to them very specifically about what's in it for them. And then you've talked through some of the barriers, like what are the challenges we're going to encounter in budgeting and timing, ordinances and standard methods, and try to work through solutions to those things like variances where you need it, and developing long-term solutions like new manuals. You saw Susan's example of the rain garden manual, and try to get everybody to have standard practices to move things forward. So these are just some of the methods for collaboration that we've had experience with and some success with. What we're going to do now, I think, is move to a question and answer period, and Josh will facilitate, and we're happy to have discussions and hear your thoughts about all the things we talked about today.
We have 22 minutes by my watch before we have to do some wrap-up comments. I'm going to open the first question, and then Caitlin has the microphone, and we'll walk around. So just get your hands up in the air, and we'll identify folks. My first question is about Bob's first bullet here, and it was something that everyone identified as sort of, you need to do this for collaboration. You need to identify common goals and establish a shared vision. That is much harder than the 6 words up there would suggest. So I guess in your experience, what have been effective tools, processes, or ways for doing that, for identifying those goals?
I think that when we talk about the procedures or methods for common goals, a lot of it has to do with convening and getting people together and sort of having them talk about what their concerns are, what are the things they're worried about, and what are the things that they would like to see. And you sort of, it's like a Venn diagram. You look for where there's overlap between, well, you have this goal and I have this goal, and like in between here, we have a shared goal. And try to build off of that and say, what if we started with that point and we did this and this and this, and try to get this sort of buy-in built up over time, and to bring in some outside experts to talk about other things that have worked in other places, to float a shared vision and get people's reactions to it, and then adjust that based on what you hear, and make sure people are sensing that you're actually listening to what they're saying and making adjustments to accommodate them, and then they feel more encouraged to participate. So I think those are just some of the things that we've seen.
I think it's really important, too, what tools you're using to get that listening session to happen. And there's one website, it's called Liberating Structures. Has anyone ever heard of that before? There's like 20 or so methods for you to do input sessions with a group of folks. So if you've got like 20 people at the table, how are you really going to come up with your common goals and objectives? Takes a lot of time. But there's some methodologies where you give each person the opportunity to speak, and some people are going to talk, like me, and some people are going to be very quiet and have a lot going on in their mind, and you want to hear from everybody. You want to have enough space for everybody to be able to contribute. And so I think, to add on, is just creating the right venues and using the right tool to collaborate and get people's voice heard. And what you'll find is once people are bought in for themselves, they'll show up because it's important now.
I agree with most everything that's been said so far. Not sure that there's anything I could add other than to point out that it's always good to have one or two primary goals that may drive it. And the examples I gave earlier are almost all regulatory driven. I hate to say it, but it's either regulatory driven or flooding in the stormwater world. So you need to make it clear what your primary goals are, and then of course there's a whole list of other secondary goals. All of them are equally important. You can't lose sight of them, but use those primary goals to bring people to the table as your starting point for discussions. And the other thing I would say is the champion, the leader of the group, has to be somewhat directive. Usually when you're putting down goals, missions, visions, it's always better to react to something that's already written than to try to have a big wordsmithing session.
Okay, so Caitlin's in the back. She's got the microphone. We have time for, I think, 4 questions based on the average time. Right up here in the front. Don't forget who you are and where you're from.
Hello, my name's Julia Bunn. I'm a landscape designer here in the city, and I work with rain gardens. The Spirited Gardener is my business. And I've been also involved with the churches had a infrastructure problem with having to pay for the water taxes, and the city got them all. They got organized to get the city to give them a credit, and they're promising to do some things in order to make things happen. And so what I'm looking for is the funding or the money, because we have over 250 churches that are interested in being the example, in being the opportunity to teach people in the neighborhoods to do these things. And I have to make a living wage. So, you know, it's all well organized and ready to go, but we just need support to take it to the next level as far as that goes. My question is, like, do you know where we could go to do that? And also, I wanted to thank Bob for mentioning nature needs a place to live. There's no place anymore out there anymore. So every time we build bridges between areas, what all this infrastructure does, we're helping nature to remain diverse in all our different areas. And then, let me see. Oh, the last one was Kevin's Rain Gardens is a local source for building rain gardens in the Minnesota Rain Gardens Manual. There's a lot of local effective materials available for us. And thank you so much for what you brought today.
So there's a plethora of educational resources out here in our region on what works and what doesn't for rain gardens. That question of financial resources to facilitate that kind of work, though, is one that could use a couple seconds. Bob? By a couple, I mean a lot, because financial resources are important. So,
I very quickly mentioned both the rebate and credit programs, and those are really, really instrumental in making sure that programs like the one you're talking about to actually get off the ground and gather some steam. What I've done a lot of funding programs, usually based on stormwater user fees, but you don't have to have a user fee to have a rebate program. The example of Onondaga and Syracuse is a good one. They chose not to have an impervious area-based fee, but what they do have is that they have quite a bit of SRF funds coming in to manage their CSO program. And so they realized that if they were to basically manage all the impervious area on public spaces, they still wouldn't achieve their CSO goals. They had to have, I think it was somewhere between 30 and 50% of the private properties in the long term would eventually have to manage their runoff as well. And so they created their Green Infrastructure Fund to essentially give monies out on an annual basis. I think they have as much as $2 million a year that's going towards these rebate programs. And then you have to set up a structure for how you prioritize those. Some locations set up as a first come, first serve, which for equity reasons is probably the way to go, but you really need to also target your funds at the larger properties, the ones that are, have the most runoff.
I'm glad you're talking about working with churches and community groups. What we found in Seattle when we launched our Rainwise program is we needed demonstration projects. And I know under your Millennium Fund, perhaps there could be some funding for demonstration projects. Those are the best places to get to folks. We're doing a Holy Names Church in Seattle. Interestingly, a group called Sustainable Seattle received grant funding to do the outreach to the church. So we're not paying for that. The city isn't. They have enough roof area to get a $100,000 rebate to build 12 rain gardens and do a de-pave project as well. It's 75% Hispanic, so we're also reaching into a different community about this. And we have a local contractor who's doing the work, Rain Dog Designs. The one thing about our program, because it's a rebate program, the Holy Names Church had to choose a contractor. So when you go to the site, you're going to see a whole list of them. The city needs to stay out of that dialogue. That's not fair, for us to recommend. Now, I'm just going to give you a little word of caution. The rebate program from house to house has been very challenging for the smaller contractors. It doesn't pay a lot. There are some upfront costs for homeowners, or the contractor has to kind of eat those costs at first. We're doing some things like Stewardship Partners is developing a revolving fund in which smaller contractors could be, they're going to pilot it this year where they can sign up. We'll pay for them to be part of that program through craft funding, so it's all separate. And it's a fund where once they're approved for the rebate, they can go get that upfront funds. The person who owns the home can sign off their rebate to the contractor directly. So we're trying to get the money out, the upfront costs down to create equity. And then finally, it's a volume and scale issue. And so we've got some awesome contractors who are willing to do it because they care. So that's the other piece of developing a new sector. And I think this collaborative group's got some ideas around that.
And I should say that at some point this year or next year, the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency is working on modifying its SRF, which Lorenz referred to, State Revolving Funds, a loan program. Historically has been difficult to use for stormwater management projects across the board. They're working on some modifications which are all to be determined. But it should create, in theory, another potential funding mechanism for the kinds of projects that you're talking about. That is work that is underway, and when it's done and on the books, we'll have another roundtable about it. So, additional questions? Over here, John. Oh, we got one on the way.
Mr. Newport, I have a question, and to the other panelists. What is the U.S. government doing with regards to flood water or storm water in terms of diverting storm water from areas that in the country which typically has a great degree of storm water, divert that storm water to areas like California, Nevada, to deal with forest fires and drought and things of that nature?
There's actually fairly small amount of work at large-scale diversions of water out of the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes Compact governs how much water can be removed from the Great Lakes Basin, and it's pretty restrictive. There was I think, a fear before the Governor's Compact was signed that water would be, sent to Arizona, and they wanted to try to get out ahead of that issue. But that being said, there's a lot of areas that even locally, without going to California, you can divert stormwater and make very beneficial use out of it. We were doing some projects in the western suburbs, and one of the areas that we were in, everybody was using groundwater as a source of drinking water, and they had done some projections about the withdrawal rates and the way that the aquifer was declining, and seeing that we could have a shortage of water off into the future. And the city also had identified a groundwater recharge area. USGS helped map that for them. And we talked about the fact that would be a natural area to implement a lot of green infrastructure practices, because you could not only help manage your stormwater in that area, but you could recharge the groundwater and then use that in the future, because we knew that that was a finite resource that was running out. So I think the basic answer is we don't try to send it really far, but we try to implement that concept locally because it makes a lot of sense.
Probably way off topic, but We just finished the Colorado River Basin study for the Bureau of Reclamation, looking at their long-range water supply needs, and they did indeed look at piping water into the Colorado Basin from the Mississippi, and it's not a green solution. It fell off very quickly. It's just not cost-effective, and yet the cost of pumping is just not worth it. Much rather stick to local solutions to how to manage your stormwater.
Hi, I'm John Anderson with Greenleaf Advisors. I wonder if any of you have had experience with or know of folks that are exploring market-based solutions where in a distributed way a local party is providing some type of stormwater service that's getting paid for by a utility or another property owner to get the market mechanisms into our solutions.
Well, one thing that we're doing is working with Bushmans to develop cisterns, and we've used our local green core, kind of like yours, to sell rain barrels in the past, and now they're going to be a cistern provider, looking at talking to them about different models for cisterns, because people want them under their decks, or they want them at the side of the house, or modular. So that would be one market area, and actually a really important one for us, because in Seattle there's a lot of areas that won't take rain gardens because of our geological, hydrological.
But let me just take that example a little further. So those cisterns or retention ponds, to the extent that we're able to measure and monitor the quantity of water, that avoids utilities' need to process that during a critical time period.
Exactly.
My question would get to, do you have any examples around the country where somebody's actually measuring that, and then that party that's storing it's getting paid by a third party for the benefit to the community?
I know of just one example in my backyard, Washington, D.C. They have just implemented something called a stormwater retention credit, and it's not a credit in the way we were talking about before, reducing your fee. What they've done is essentially told developers, if you want to essentially go beyond the design criteria for your property, which in D.C. is 1.2 inches of stormwater, you can then sell that delta to other developers. And basically, the DC Department of the Environment is going to become a trading house for stormwater retention credits to basically trade between developers who can manage, either overmanage, or if they can't because of site conditions or soils or whatnot, then they could buy credits on this exchange.
And the last year, the new watershed management ordinance here in Cook County from the Water Reclamation District allows for that provision of storing water off-site. It doesn't create a marketplace, but it creates the sort of necessary regulatory conditions for the idea that I would store some of my stormwater off-site in some very specific circumstances, which may, for creative folks in the room like Margaret and John and others, be the fodder they need for thinking through how this might work here in northeastern Illinois. Is that safe, John and Jim? Yes, good. MWRD is nodding, which is always the response you hope for.
We hope for.
Any other questions? We have time for one, maybe two more. Yona's pointing to someone I can't see behind the podium, sorry.
Dennis.
Oh, Dennis, behind the podium. Hey, hi, Dennis, behind the podium.
Dennis Strayer with Geosyntech Consultants, and we are doing some green infrastructure planning in various parts of the region, including the Millennium Reserve area. My question is for Bob. And Bob, this is from a regulatory perspective. Traditionally, with gray infrastructure, very centralized solution, very well-defined time frame. Green infrastructure, as you kind of pointed out, it really should be more of a programmatic, long-term, as needed or as opportunities present themselves. How is US EPA approaching that in terms of providing flexibility? So if a city or a community or watershed says, we're going to fix our problem over 50 years by changing our public works practices, by changing our ordinances, so both public and private investment is done in a green way versus a gray way, and is that kind of flexibility being granted, and are there some good case studies that we could refer to where that's happening?
That's a really good question, Dennis. And what I think we see, it's an evolving sort of approach for how to do that. Traditionally, on something like a CSO settlement, there was looking for certainty. Like, we're going to put in these 12 things, and they're going to be sized in this way, and it's going to control this much flow, and we know we'll meet the CSO control objective. when you start to introduce green infrastructure into that equation, there's a lot of new variables, like how fast can we implement green infrastructure, at what locations? Is it public? Is it private? If it's on private, how are we going to guarantee it stays in green infrastructure use? Are we going to get an easement or anything like that? And all those things create more uncertainty. So just in general, what we're doing is trying to set a target for a level of green infrastructure implementation and then allow the community some flexibility over time to capitalize on the best opportunities in order to meet that target. And then there would be some sort of fallback if we reach a point where the city's like, hey, it's not going to work. Then you go back to a more traditional gray infrastructure solution to capture that last amount. But it's really changing before our eyes in terms of how these kinds of permits and consent decrees are written, because green infrastructure more and more is being seen as a large component. The Syracuse example that Lorenz discussed, I think, is a good example of a consent decree that, when it was updated to incorporate the green components, added a lot more sort of practical kinds of considerations. And Washington, D.C. recently proposed, they haven't gotten approved yet by EPA, but they're going to propose to EPA a new CSO plan that has a lot more green infrastructure. So there's a lot of new case studies that have some sort of the latest approaches that you see in terms of how the regulatory system is accommodating green infrastructure.
The example of Washington, D.C. is an interesting one because it was the environmental community that pushed really hard for the consent decree to get issued, which basically D.C. was planning 3 separate CSO tunnels. But as this green infrastructure wave came along, they're now proposing, as Bob just said, to shift away from having, they're still going to have one of the tunnels for sure, the one that really manages most of their CSO, but the 2 others, they're hoping to either downsize or maybe even eliminate altogether. And interestingly enough, it's some of the environmental groups who are resisting this, who you would think would be the same groups who would support it. So it sort of depends because of the certainty. They want the certainty that you're going to capture and treat that CSO.
Up here in the front. Final question. Well, I have one more question after that. So, penultimate question.
Hello, my name is Gordon Ziegenhagen. I'm with Draper and Kramer, a local real estate firm. I'd like your comment on this observation that I've seen around, and that's, you know, we often there was a slide that talked about if you're completely redoing repaving in an alley, that, you know, you said, all right, if you just rip out the asphalt, put new asphalt, $20 a square foot, and maybe 10% more if you design it now in a more sustainable way. I totally agree with that, and you know, on projects I've been involved with, we've done just that. The situation I see a lot of, though, is where you've got an existing large parking lot area. It really doesn't necessarily need to be completely ripped out, and now you're looking at not a 10% increase to comply with ordinances and with stormwater requirements, but maybe 1,000% increase. So what do people do? You know, oftentimes you see people that are maybe breaking the law a little bit. They're not complying with ordinances. They're not getting building permits. I'm curious because they don't want to face the financial consequences of compliance. Any thoughts on maybe solving or addressing this situation?
When we talk about the first case, where we might call that new development, and that could be redoing a street entirely, or it could be creating a new hotel or a new commercial area, and that's a great time to implement green infrastructure practices because you can integrate them into the plan, and as you said, ultimately there's going to be a cost savings associated with doing the green infrastructure in conjunction with the implementation of the initial plan. In the other example, we sometimes call that retrofit, where your impervious surfaces are all there. The space might be kind of tight already. There's sidewalks and there's cable lines and all kinds of things that are involved in decision making at the site. And you say, well, I want to go and put in impervious pavement, or I want to put in bioswales. It's an expensive proposition. It's logistically difficult, and And so those become very prioritized in terms of where are we going to do that. And the city may look at which areas of the sewer system do we have some bottlenecks, and those are high priority areas to get some relief. And so that the city would sort of co-fund with a private property owner a project to retrofit some areas to get some stormwater out of the system. We might also say, we anticipate there's going to be redevelopment taking place in 5 years, so let's just wait 5 years and do it at that time. But I agree with you that that's one of the major challenges in our urban areas is we've got lots of impervious areas there. They're not undergoing redevelopment at this time. We'd like to put green infrastructure in. How are we going to pay for it?
The key to that really is to just have a plan that is tied to long-term asset renewal. So if you have a parking lot that you've identified, its condition's okay now, well, maybe 5 to 10 years based on pavement condition deterioration, then you would do it. But if you haven't planned for it, then you lose that opportunity when it comes up. You have to have it as part of your long-term capital plan.
So my final question, which I will give you all a second to think about as Mary Sue comes up to give her adjourning comments, is any final thoughts or parting wisdom as many of the partners in this room embark upon this thing we are calling the Calumet Stormwater Collaborative? That is my question to all of you. And Bob, you're a member of it, so you get to go first. I want to thank all of you for coming. Mary Sue's going to come up and give a final thought once our speakers are done.
I thought Josh referred to the Calumet Stormwater Collaborative. We're going to try to put a lot of the things we talked about today in action in the Calumet area over the next 1 to 2 years. We want to try to have a joint vision of what our priorities are and get all on the same page and align our funding resources and our other efforts to the highest priority opportunities. And I think it's a great chance to put into action a lot of what we talked about today. Part of what we want to do is get this shared vision together. In some of the earlier project lists that were developed in that area, they're very fragmented. And a group would submit something and say, well, this makes a lot of sense for me, but it maybe didn't make sense for their neighbor. Maybe if we put those two together and we talk about each one's interests, we can get to a point where we have a more shared vision of what we want to do. So I think we need to have a lot of dialogue over the next 6 months to talk about what the goals are, to frame up some prioritization criteria, to get some pilot projects so we get some successes that everybody can get enthusiastic about and get behind, and then we can sustain that energy over a longer period of time to keep moving forward.
So my observation as with coordinating is that you've got different people who are going to be sitting at the table for different reasons. So there's the stormwater technical folks who are really looking at the engineering and best practices and testing and modeling, and that group needs to talk to itself. There's the outreach coordinators who work for municipalities, and they have regulatory requirements and other requirements. That group needs to talk to itself. You have nonprofit organizations who have their own coordinating efforts, and maybe as a municipality, I don't organize them necessarily, but that's kind of what GRIP is for us, although I do participate, but it's not in a regulatory framework at all. So I'm not bringing in some of those issues that maybe municipalities wouldn't bring to that group. That group needs to speak to itself, and you need to have a way to create a format for them to talk to each other. One of the models in Washington, we have the Puget Sound Partnership. It's run by our Department of Ecology, our state department. That group has created, or out of it has become a group called STORM, that's Stormwater Regional Outreach Municipalities, and they're worried about their permitting, so they are talking. They have another group called the EcoNet. That's where they brought in all the NGOs and nonprofits. Actually, there's not a lot of consulting firms in either of those, because I know the engineering and consulting firms are there too. So I'm going to leave that out of this collaboration. So we have what's called the EcoNets, organized in 12 counties. And then we have the STORM group, which is about 63 municipalities. And together, and I was part of that group too, together what we created was the Puget Sound Starts Here campaign. So that was one collaboration around stormwater management. So as we're moving on green, it's really green infrastructure. It's good to think of it the same way.
because sometimes you don't want someone in the room. The GRIP partnership happens to be consultants, nonprofits, and government. So it's a little unique, and the stuff we talk about is really learning and collaborating. And the technical stuff that we tend to focus on is becoming translators for the public. So we'll learn enough just to be dangerous and not say the wrong thing. So I think when you're, make sure you know your audience and you're coordinating them the way that, it's going to get the best benefit for the person or the entity participating.
I guess my only thought is that don't bite off more than you could chew. I mean, putting a group like this together is going to take a lot of work. You've taken the very important first step, so congratulations to you all on that. And then, take baby steps and celebrate your successes. You mentioned doing pilots. It's very important to be visible in what you've done.
Thank you to all three of you for those pearls of wisdom. I'm Mary Sue Barrett, President of the Metropolitan Planning Council, and I want to thank every one of you for being part of making today a success. We do these roundtables fairly frequently because we like to get people together, not just virtually or through our website or through our publications, but actually face-to-face. And so thank you for some of the new faces in the room for joining us today, and I'm excited many more were tuning in by YouTube to see the webcast so that this will live on and on. In addition to Josh's work on today, I also want to highlight Abby Chrysostamo in the front. She works a lot on our water issues and has been furiously tweeting today's roundtable. So if you're not following Abby, you want to be, and retweet her, some of her posts from today. That would be a great way to help us get the word out. So what does the Metropolitan Planning Council do? We view ourselves as problem solvers, and so you're part of that. To make this region a better place to live and work. We do that through partnerships, cross-government, community, and business to solve our region's most vexing challenges, both selfishly, because we live and work here, to the benefit of our region, but also so that every other city and region can benefit as well. So increasingly, we're into sharing these ideas, and having national experts with us today is of tremendous value. So right up there at the top of our list are these stormwater management challenges. It's almost as if we need to have the big tent of multiple expertise in order to tackle this in the right way. Everything from infrastructure financing, real estate development, private property owner engagement, hydraulics, hydrology, biology. So that is no small task. It also means that we need the right tools and decision-making process to tackle these stormwater challenges. And we heard the theme loud and clear about putting the work in on the front to build these strong collaborative partnerships. So I'm glad we got to hear about how that's done in other places and some models that we can return to as we tackle our Calumet Stormwater Collaborative. We're delighted that that group is starting to get organized as of today, and our partners at CMAP, MWRD, City of Chicago, Cook County, US EPA, all of those involved with this Millennium Reserve Initiative, and new folks are going to be key to get this collectively off the ground. The decision-making process to prioritize and then to measure results will be key to the success both in the Calumet region and beyond. So we do host other events like this, and so we hope you will come back. There's some information on your chairs about 2 coming up in May. One on May 20th is going to be on the topic of urban resiliency, very related to today's topic, so some of the problems that stem from extreme weather. We'll talk about tools and systems for hazard mitigation planning and emergency preparedness, and that event is sponsored by Siemens. On May 29th, just a little bit later, we are focusing on CMAP's first update of its Go To 2040 plan. That event, sponsored by ComEd, includes a star-studded panel. We're going to be having CMAP's leader, Randy Blankenhorn, Cook County Board President, Tony Preckwinkle. We have the acting executive director from the RTA, Leanne Redden, and not quite confirmed, but we hope, confirmed, newsflash, great, Mayor of Aurora, Tom Weisner. So a really great panel, and so please join us and register for the 20th and the 29th of May roundtables. And by visiting our website, which is metroplanning.org, you can stay on top of the latest breaking information as well as through Facebook and Twitter. Please do take a moment to give us some feedback so we can make these events more interesting and valuable to you. Survey on your chair, grab an MPC staffer to give it to us, or just drop it on the table as you depart. Lorenz and Susan and Bob, you made this a fabulous and informative event. To be able to have partners like you, CH2M Hill, and colleagues across municipalities and the US EPA, all of your expertise is how we can do this work, how we can take on a daunting task like the facilitation of the Calumet Stormwater Collaborative, and we're going to continue to lean heavily on partners like you, our speakers, and many of you in the audience. So thank you again for giving us your noontime hour as a place to learn. We hope it is something that inspires you to be active, and please do stay for a moment and linger and meet someone new today, because that's part of the fun as well. Hope to see you soon. Thank you.